Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to the Guilty as Charged podcast. My name is Steven, and I am the host. Joining me is my guy, Tyler. Tyler, what's up, man? How you doing tonight?
Doing well. I think I'm a little bit more recovered than I was yesterday, so I'm ready to rock. This is going to be the most cordial, objective kind of roast that we could come up with.
Yeah, I mean, we've been fan of a team that had the same general manager for 11 years, and this is the first new draft class of the new regime. So we, of course, wanted to compare and contrast and see how the Chargers did under Joe Hortiz versus how the Chargers have done previously under Tom Telesco. And yes, I agree with FPS Gandhi here, Tyler. That is a sick jacket. Tyler's jacket game is certainly on point. Nice. You're on mute, so that's probably another team store exclusive, I assume.
Yes, it is. If you go to SoFi, go right to the team store. There's usually 4 to 6 items that are just the best thing. Whatever it costs, get it. It's worth it.
Yeah, I'm excited to get down there again. You know, Brooke and I only get to go like once a year ish, so we'll have to check it out in the fall. As always, today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks, the best and easiest way to consume daily fantasy sports. The playoffs in the NBA are all the rage. The NHL playoffs are going as well. So we strongly encourage you guys to check out prizepicks.com/guilty in order to both support the show and support your wallet. Again, that is the best and easiest way to consume daily fantasy. You simply pick more or less on a certain amount of players, and you can get as crazy with it as you want, or you can be a little safer like I do. I tend to play it a little safe on Prize Picks, but it's a fun way to consume different sports. Like I've been getting into hockey more and more as the team in Utah kind of comes about. So I've been doing that. So prizepicks.com/guilty is the best way to do that. So excited about today's show. We are going again, kind of diving back into the draft here. Today's show will be shorter, I think, than yesterday's, where we were about almost 2 hours long about grading the draft. So this is kind of another different perspective to put a bow on our draft coverage. So I'm excited to get into it. And as always, we do have a slideshow. We know you guys love the slideshows, so we'll put that up and then we'll just compare and contrast. Tyler, we'll start on kind of a general level here. We said yesterday, both of us, that we felt like it was the best class that the Chargers have had, I would say, at least in my lifetime. You know, I wasn't really following the team back when they, got Sean Merriman and Luis Castillo and that group. But for you, what like philosophies or strategies do you feel like we can now kind of identify as a Joe Hortiz philosophy?
I'd say it's only been one draft, so tough to tell. Things could go completely off the rails.
Sure.
But it really feels like even with the Ravens and their history, which we could sort of get into today, but we won't as much, they just know how to find value and they always know how to select the players, or they just go out of their way to select the players that are just kind of the good ones. I know that seems like an easy, like, duh, you should do that, but it's not always easy.
Yeah.
And it seems like relative to the consensus board, which we'll get into a lot today, Joe Hortiz and always the Ravens, you're watching the Ravens and you're always going, oh, I can't believe they fell to them. I can't believe they fell to them. It's because the Ravens always pull the trigger on these certain individuals who, maybe it's not a need at that point, but golly, you got to pull the trigger on some of these guys, like a Brendan Rice, for example, like Cornelius Johnson, like several guys that we'll talk about today. It just seems like Joe Hortiz understood that there are certain players who are just worth it at that point, regardless of, like, look, round 3, Chargers maybe needed a corner over a linebacker, but you couldn't pass up Junior Colson. Several spots throughout the draft, it just feels like he understood we're going to take the best guys that appear in front of us in every round, rather than just like, oh, the classic third round reach.
Yeah, I think we see the difference in the third round, and we'll dive into that. But also like late day 3, like I think this regime, they were still looking for potential starters. Whereas Tom Telesco's general philosophy was like, hey, like let's swing for maybe like a special teams
100%.
player, and we'll see if that person becomes anything else. But it's like you can still take chances on like potential starters late in the draft. And obviously, we'll see what happens ultimately with Brendan Rice and Cornelius Johnson. But you can teach players special teams, in the NFL. It's not like you have to only draft special teams players. And some of it is work. Some of it has worked out for Tom Telesco. Like Alohi Gilman became a really good player for the Chargers and really solid safety. But for every Alohi Gilman, there's a Xander Horvath, and so it just is like you don't have to draft only special teams players late in the draft. You can still try and find potential starters, and play the board, find value late in the draft as well. And
Yeah.
I think we've seen more often. I mean, not more often because we only have the one draft, but I think we also see that they are not afraid to take chances on somebody who's falling because of medicals. Like outside of Jamari, I can't really remember a time where it was like, okay, this player's falling for medicals, but let's take him anyway. This regime under Joe Hortiz does seem more willing to take a chance on somebody who's falling because of medicals. Like they said with Justin Eboigbe, they consensusly had a third round grade on him, but he has the medical history. Cam Hart had a consensus third round grade on him in the room, but had the medical history. And for them, it's just like, hey, like we believe that this is a good situation for us to take a chance on. We feel like this could be a starting caliber player, and we trust our medical staff to figure it out. J.K. Dobbins, same kind of deal. We can go on and on, but it just feels like they're willing to just take better football players late in the draft and not deal with like the kind of project tendencies that Tom Telesco previously did.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like these players, the floor is so much higher, and it's funny that the biggest, I mean, the one player that I feel like actually truly fell very far due to a medical was Keenan Allen, and that's the one that worked out.
Yeah.
Max Turk definitely fell. I don't know if he was supposed to go in the third round or not. I think it was still a reach in the third round, but I believe he had a torn ACL at the time. So that's one they tried to go for again. But yeah, I would say definitely gun shy. And I'm glad you mentioned the special teams versus like actually developing guys sort of route that they are going, because Brendan Rice, Cornelius Johnson, whether they make the roster, make a big impact this year, not sure. But like they are guys you could develop into a future receiver.
Yeah.
The data is there, or the RAS is there. There are reasons, and we'll talk about this later. Like you can actually see them developing into a starter. Like Cornelius Johnson could be a wide receiver 3 that you can develop, maybe even a wide receiver 2. Whereas other guys, I don't know. It felt like you were just drafting them for special teams. So we'll get into it for sure. But yeah, the stark contrast between these two, even just in one season.
Yeah, and I liked, as Sweet Jones points out, the blue star aspect of things, which is not uncommon. Like most scouting staffs do have some kind of system for the scouts, for the front office people to say, hey, like this is our one guy. But I love that Joe Ortiz like went out of his way to make sure like, whoever loved these players, like they get the chance to see them on the Chargers. It just is a cool way for Joe Ortiz to involve everybody a little bit more. And that's something that Chad Alexander talked about. Joe did his absolute best to make sure that every person involved in the process was involved. We saw several of the assistant coaches be able to get on the phone and talk to the players that the Chargers drafted. So again, first draft, but it just seemed like more collaborative overall, just from start to finish throughout the process. So the blue star aspect of that, I think, is a good way to see that come to fruition.
Yeah, I wanted to point both of those things out, the collaborative process and that blue star part, but it was hard for me to specifically know for sure the Chargers never really did that. Yeah. But I also never saw that they did either. So
they never talked about it publicly.
Right. So if they did, I don't know, but I can't say they didn't. But yes, I 100% wanted to bring that up. I just couldn't find like another aspect but yeah, I'm ready to get into this if you are.
Yeah, let's do it. Again, this is going to be comparing and contrasting what the Chargers have now currently under Joe Ortiz in previous 11 years of data. Did you use the Raiders draft as well, or just?
It's mentioned once in here, and I think the chat has already figured out which part it's mentioned in. But yes, the specific round in this draft.
Okay, yeah. So comparing and contrasting what just Chargers mostly. So again, this is the Joe Hortiz schooled his predecessor show, Joe Hortiz versus Tom Telesco. Let's get into it.
Yeah, so the first thing I wanted to bring up was the round 3 stuff. And I actually had made a video, I think 2 years ago after the 2022 class about Telesco versus the consensus. Now, the only bummer is that the consensus board only goes back to 2016. So I actually, I don't really know what the exact average would be. But honestly, looking at more recent history, I'd argue, and I think it's easy to argue, Telesco has drafted better in the second half of his career with the Chargers than the first half. Like I can't bring Craig Mager into this, for example, who was overdrafted. It feels like and other players, in 13, 14, and 15. So this is the round 3 average selection versus the consensus since 2016. And on average, Tom Telesco took a player in the 3rd round 96.5 spots earlier than the consensus ranking. That's 96.5 spots earlier than the consensus ranking. Now, again, the consensus board does not mean these players are bad. And we're just pointing out the idea of a reach or a steal in some of these rounds. Telesco historically overdrafted, and I don't think anyone would argue with me that that is not true. Joe Hortiz with Junior Colson. Junior Colson was actually taken 5 spots later than the consensus ranking. Yeah. Now, totally get it. Makes sense. And also, for what it's worth, Telesco did get Deion Henley the previous year, a linebacker, in the 3rd round, later than he was projected on the consensus board. So it's not like Telesco has never had this in the 3rd round. But yes, 96.5 spots earlier than the average ranking, than the ranking on the consensus board. And with the Raiders, of course, like, okay, maybe it was a Spanos thing. Maybe it was a Chargers thing. The Raiders, and we all knew it was coming, they were going to take a player much earlier than they were projected on the consensus board. So with the Raiders, Telesco took Delmar Glaze. They took him at 77, and he was 152nd on the consensus. So again, does not mean Delmar Glaze is a bad player by any means, but we know that Telesco historically overdrafts in round 3. It's very consistent. Joe Hortiz, at least in year 1, found value.
Yeah, I think even, Josh Palmer, who's become a good player, and I liked more than most people that year, was considered a reach at that time. And for every Deion Henley, there's a Trey McKitty or JT Woods. So yeah, the 3rd round is definitely like the specific, way to look at this. And I think if you, I'm going to pull up the Ravens draft history and even just look at, their 3rd round picks real quick. 3rd round players in recent years. Obviously, they took Adisa Isaac this year. Trenton Simpson last year was not anything special, but then you have Travis Jones, who's obviously become a really quality football player and was on the board when the Chargers took JT Woods. You have Odafe Owe, you have Justin Madubuike, you have Miles Boykin, you have Orlando Brown Jr., Mark Andrews, Tyus Bowser, Zadarius Smith. Mm-hmm. Like this list goes on and on and on with 3rd round players who become Kelechi Osemele. Like it's going to be different for the Chargers in the 3rd round, I would wager, just because like there are these players who fall every year for whatever reason, and whether it's positional value, like I think for Junior Colson, and Joe Hortiz is just going to take the good football players when they come to him. And at this point with Junior Colson, man, I think it was a steal, obviously. So it's one specific thing, but it's a big, big deal. Getting those types of players versus JT Woods versus Trey McKitty versus Trey Pipkins, who has become a good football player, but it's like it's a huge difference. And this is a massive way to increase the depth on your football team by taking players like Junior Colson and Travis Jones, all these guys.
Absolutely. The funny thing is, and I'm so glad I did this because I didn't know they would hire someone from the Ravens. But when I did the Telesco versus consensus video a few years ago, the team I compared him to was the Ravens. So I have all like the data until 2022. And so on average, the Ravens in round 3 specifically take players 4.2 spots later than they're projected to go. So it's actually very close here. So just now, Chargers, Junior Colson, 5 spots, Ravens on average in the 3rd round from 2016 to 2022, about 4 spots. So I could see this being a consistent pattern. And you mentioned like Justin Madubuike, like they always find these guys and it almost seems to always work out. And even if it doesn't, you feel good about it. So I wanted to lead off with this one because I think it's maybe the most popular thing Chargers fans think about with Telesco. Yeah, but it certainly holds up. And then he literally just did this in Vegas.
Yeah. And it holds up. I think it holds a lot of weight. And, we talked about that in 2022. Arjun has talked about it. The 3rd round is really like historically where these great teams find awesome value, and there are ways to be able to get impact football players that the Chargers were just always missing out. Not always, but for the most part, missing out on.
Yeah. So let's look at this from a, more broader scope. Arjun tweeted this out several times, like that Joe Hortiz was sticking a lot closer to the consensus board. And I was curious, okay, like how much closer does he stick to the consensus board than Tom Telesco? So again, since 2016, Tom Telesco on average takes a player 27 point spots earlier than the ranking on the consensus board. And that's across the entire draft. Joe Hortiz just 2.7 spots later than their ranking. So he kind of gets a mini steal here. Telesco on average across the draft is taking players about 28 spots earlier than they're ranked. So again, same sort of thing. The third round is the big magnified biggest difference, but still like Joe Hortiz 2.7 spots later versus Tom Telesco 27.7 spots earlier.
Yeah, and I think this again, this is the example for me of like third round versus sixth and seventh round. Like, Dean Leonard is a great special teams player, but he was like in the 500s and they took him in the seventh round. Xander Horvath was same kind of deal. So, for Joe Ortiz, it's interesting here because if he hadn't taken Tarheeb Still where he took him, number is probably much higher too.
Oh, yeah.
Joe Ortiz had the one reach, which I understand why he took that player. But if you take that one selection off the board, or even if you just like moved him down to like the sixth round, that number is even higher for the Chargers. So, this is important data across the board. I think Telesco, we can agree for the most part that in rounds 1 and round 2, like he's pretty close to consensus board.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is everything else that comes after it. And now Joe Ortiz is saying, for the most part in the first year, I'm going to stick to the consensus board. And he did say after the draft that they felt like the players they took in each round were the best players on their respective boards. So I think that does pan out over the consensus board as well.
Yeah, it definitely does. Moving on to the next thing. So people are already mentioning, trading up for Kenneth Murray and all the trade ups that Tom Telesco had done. What was so unique about this particular draft? And it was like, oh, I didn't realize you could do that, even though I did. And I knew that, like we all knew that, but we hadn't seen it. Yeah. All the trade ups for Tom Telesco, they were sacrificing selections. So in 2013, you give up a round 4 pick for Manti Te'o. 2014, give up a round 4 pick for Jeremiah Tauchu. 2015, give up a round 4 pick for Melvin Gordon. 2020, give up your round 3 pick for Kenneth Murray. Obviously, you give up like the second round pick there as well, but that's just to move up. So instead of giving up a selection, they just swapped 110, which they had acquired via trade, for 137 to move up to take the player that they wanted. So they took Ladd McConkey, who could have been a first round pick, was definitely one of the best 34 players in the draft, for sure. They moved up to get him, and all they did was swap the picks. Now, there's an argument, sure, and like partially why I gave an A- to the selection. Going from 110 to 137 may have changed which defensive backs were available, or running backs or whatever. Like, sure, that is definitely something lost. But the Chargers still made 9 selections. So they got Joe Alt at 5, and then they found a way to get someone that Joe Hortiz says all the scouts loved and all the scouts wanted, and Ladd McConkey, and they did that. They traded up, but they didn't sacrifice any quantity of picks. Yes, they moved back from 110 to 137, but they didn't give up that 4th rounder. I mean, I don't know if it'll turn out well. We'll see. But like the Rams gave up a future 3rd round pick for Braden Fisk. Like that's a lot to give up. I forget what the Falcons gave it for Rook. I believe they traded up for him. No.
Yes.
I forget what the value or the compensation was, but he gave up picks to move up for these players. And they were bigger jumps. Don't get me wrong. Like it's not like, Joe Hortiz like didn't have to give up a 3rd. Like, yeah, he didn't have to give up a 3rd. It's not like he had to move up 25 spots for Ladd McConkey, but still he managed to move up without sacrificing picks. And I even think that if they had done that, let's say in like round 1 next year, they're moving up from, 32, and let's say they move from 32 to 24, they maybe give up some picks. I bet you in the 2nd round or even the 3rd round, they trade back, find ways to make more picks. They're just always so good about that.
Yeah. So real quick, the Falcons traded picks 43 and number 79 for pick 35 and a 5th round pick in next year's draft. So
okay.
That was a pretty steep price. They didn't necessarily lose a pick, but trading 79 to move up 4 spots or whatever it was, that's tough. And I liked Rook a lot, but I think Tom Telesco never had like an egregious trade in terms of trading up, but like you mentioned, it was also not always for premium positions for off-ball linebacker, running back, linebacker, but the trades were never too outlandish. Like, the Vikings traded like a shit ton of picks for Dallas Turner. Like the Vikings next year only have a first round pick, 2 5th-round picks, and a 6th-round pick. That's their entire draft arsenal right now for next year because of what they've done trading with the Houston Texans and the Dallas Turner trade. So it's just, that is egregious to me. Tom Telesco, the bad part here is trading for the non-premium positions. And I guess I jumped the gun. That's my mistake here. So Telesco, 3 round 4 picks and 1 round 3 pick given up for 2 off-ball linebackers, 1 edge who at the time was listed as a linebacker, and 1 running back. And Joe Hortiz traded up to take a wide receiver. And that does, pan out for the Ravens history as well. Like whenever they were aggressive, it was for offensive tackle, for wide receiver, for edge rushers. They traded up for Odafe. They traded up for, or not traded up for, who am I thinking of? Did they trade up for Ronnie Stanley? No. Anyways.
Linderbaum?
Yeah. No, they traded down to take Linderbaum, actually. But the emphasis on premium positions is in the early rounds is certainly, more relevant now. And like, I love Brock Bowers, but like they did take a tight end in the draft in the first round this year and a guard in the second round for the Raiders this year.
Yeah. We'll see what happens, over time, of course. But yeah, it was so frustrating. When I was a younger fan, this was a while ago, 2013. Oh yeah, traded up for Lamar Jackson. Yes, I traded back into the first round for Lamar Jackson. Absolutely. At the time as a younger fan, it's like, oh, cool, they traded up for Manti Te'o and they traded up for Jeremiah Tauchu. Oh, this is super fun. But now as an older fan who's weighed cost versus benefit and had Arjun in my ear for the last 3-4 years, the idea of Arjun watching these drafts and them trading up for Kenneth Murray or Melvin Gordon or Manti Te'o, giving up these selections is nuts. And not that you can't give up picks for non-premium positions. Obviously, the Ravens have no problem trading and then giving huge money to Roquan Smith as a linebacker, but they're not just limited to trading up for non-premium positions, and trading up for a wide receiver, even if they had given up a pick, makes sense.
Yeah. And I did expect the Chargers to trade down in this draft. They didn't. They had calls several times, but they wanted to move up for Ladd. They wanted to make sure they took Junior Colson. So I think when they don't enter the draft with 7 picks, I'm curious to see what kind of that looks like if they're going to trade down and accumulate picks. So like next year, as they're picking like 22 and they only have their 7, or I guess they could technically get some compensatory picks, but what I mean? Like if they only have their own picks and they're picking in the 20s, I would kind of expect them to trade down at that point.
Yeah, as would I. Trade down, maybe accumulate some, later day 3 picks or whatever. Another thing that the Chargers did this year, which the Chargers had never done, not that they always needed to, but it's notable. Tom Telesco, he had 2 double dips at wide receiver in 11 drafts. 1 in 2020 for Joe Reed and KJ Hill, and then 1 in 2023 for Quentin Johnson and Darius Davis. I have an asterisk there, though, because as you mentioned previously, it's not like they were like wide receiver prospects that they double dipped by. It was a special teams thing. Joe Reed was a wide receiver, but it was a gadget sort of guy. KJ Hill technically was a special teamer only really for them too. Whereas Joe Hortiz, not only did he triple down at wide receiver, they went with Ladd McConkey, second round, sure, but he's going to play significant snaps, eventually be a starter. Brendan Rice, Cornelius Johnson, these guys can also become starters. And maybe they play special teams. Johnson will definitely play special teams, I would think. But these guys can also develop into an actual NFL starter, or a wide receiver 2 or 3, I should say. One of the wide receiver 1 and 2 or 3s. And that is more than I can say about the Chargers and their draft history under Tom Telesco.
Yeah, I think you could have even put an asterisk next to KJ Hill because he was their punt returner to start that year. But yeah, I think the Joe Reed, Darius Davis thing is like the perfect, encapsulation of like how day 3 is going to be different. And Darius Davis is an all-pro punt returner. I'm not mad that the Chargers took him, and Ryan Ficken, stood on the table for him. So that's, it is what it is there. But, it's just, you take the good players and you can teach them special teams. You don't have to take the special teams players and hope they can become good football players. So it's just a different philosophy here. The Joe Reed conversation was a lot of fun, especially after Anthony Lynn compared him to Percy Harvin. But man, it was just like, it's just different. Like you can still get quality impact football players on day 3, you don't have to just automatically pivot to, okay, it's special teams time. And that's always what it felt like with day 3, outside of like a couple of picks here and there. So the wide receiver thing here in particular is the perfect way to do that. I'm glad we have this on here. I do expect Cornelius Johnson to be like a special teams type, and I think he will have value there. But, you know, in a previous draft, Brendan Rice, who the Chargers posted that video today of the call, they had not posted it previously. I cannot imagine like putting my best friend to rest and then also getting drafted in the same day. Like the amount of emotions that he must have felt is crazy. But that kind of player is not selected under Tom Telesco. You know, they just would have let somebody else take him, and the Chargers would have taken, you know, some other kick returner or some other, you know, tight end who couldn't block or whatever, some just like major dart throw. So the Chargers getting value in the 7th round, that's a huge difference. You never know, like Brendan Rice, Cornelius Johnson become, you know, quality football players, and you never would have had that chance under Tom Telesco.
No, that Jamari selection was like out of nowhere because it was so uncharacteristic for Tom Telesco to find somebody. And that's why we were so excited. Like, wow, I didn't know he was available.
It was shocking.
And 2, I can't believe that they actually took him. And Jamari, it's funny because he's the furthest difference between consensus versus draft pick that Telesco has on day 3. And look, maybe you don't think Jamari's been a great starter by any means, but heck, you got 2 starting seasons out of him at 2 separate positions, and he almost saved your ass the previous season by playing left tackle with no preparation. Just having someone like that, I mean, you never know. Palmer gets hurt. Okay, who's going to be our bigger X type? It ain't Quinton. It's not Ladd. All right, Brendan Rice, you're up. And like you could, I'm not saying that he's going to replicate and be the starting big time X for them, but you can kind of see him eventually getting there. You can at least buy into that idea. It's not running out, and not to make this like a height thing, but like it's not running out Michael Bandy and Darius Davis and DeAndre Carter and some of these guys who are just special teams guys.
Yeah.
And Herbert just has to throw to special teams guys. Throwing to someone who actually could be a starting X at some point, it's very refreshing. And you know, all respect to Max Duggan, Xander Horvath, and some of these guys, but Tevin Reese, like they just have some options for plan C. Absolutely. You know, but Xander Horvath, Max Duggan, these guys, like, didn't really need to, especially with Max Duggan, didn't really need to take him. And they did, and we called it. That was the annoying thing. It's like, we're like, here comes Max Duggan, 3, 2, 1. And it was him. Respect to Max Duggan. I didn't realize he was actually very much so right in that range on the consensus board to be drafted, but we all kind of knew it was coming, that it wasn't super going to work out, and it unfortunately has not so far. It's nice to see them go, nope, let's get 2 more receivers. One of them is definitely playing special teams, but can also develop for us. We know how to use him. And then Rice, you feel good about too.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens when the Chargers do need a different backup quarterback. You know, maybe Easton Stick is that guy for the next 5 years or whatever. I don't know. But even the Easton Stick selection, like that was in the middle of the Chargers' big playoff push. And it was like 5th round, let's take our 3rd string quarterback. It's like, well, you didn't need to do that. You didn't have to do that. So that part I think is going to be interesting. But yeah, man, I think just the day 3 approach here is so different from what we're used to in such a refreshing way. Like the whole thing was refreshing. I was listening to a bunch of like the draft graded, you know, like NFL Stock Exchange. I was listening, reading a bunch of the other articles, and for the Raiders, it was like, well, they drafted 2 really good football players in the first 2 rounds, and then we just like don't know. And I'm like, yeah, that's how it was for
sounds about right
for the Chargers.
Yes, that sounds about right, guys. Very good. And I hope they work out. I actually genuinely believe that the Raiders draft class is actually pretty solid this past season.
For Telesco, it was a pretty good class. I'm not going to
lie. Definitely. Some of it, maybe just luck or just taking the good player. You know, Jackson Powers Johnson in round 2. All right. Like I get why you'd have to do that. But yeah, they did okay. But for previous Chargers years, especially those early ones, it was rough. Another one is that Hortiz, we talked about day 3 picks and these wide receivers. Hortiz is finding exceptional value later on in the draft. And we're just talking here about round 6, round 7. And Telesco, like the 3rd round, reaches a bit earlier, reaches a bit more than the consensus has them ranked. So he reaches on average about 29 spots earlier than they're ranked on the consensus board. Hortiz gets these guys on day 3, round 6 and 7, 54 spots later than the ranking. And that was very obvious. Like, that's part of the reason their grades for Johnson Rice for me were an A-, because you get Brendan Rice 114 spots later, Cornelius Johnson 53 spots later. And those two guys, looking at Telesco's draft history of the 20 guys he's taken since 2016, these guys would be the second and fifth best value adds for Tom Telesco among the 20 day 3 selections that he made. So it's just nice to see that, we sort of already rehashed this over, talked about it, but it's nice to see that Joe Hortiz is, again, going to find these guys with exceptional value, and you feel like you got exceptional value for these players, even as late as late day 3.
Yeah, and I do you have something about like the RAS scores too, or?
I do. It's more of an overall look at them,
okay.
But yeah, we can get into that if you want. So just draft class on average, and then we can talk about everything else. So on average, now it's one draft class, so we'll see. Although last year the Ravens had a pretty solid RAS draft class overall. Yeah. But the relative athletic score, Joe Hortiz leans into overall a higher RAS on average than Tom Telesco did from 2013 to 2023. So this we can get all the way back to 2013-4 because the RAS website has all this stuff. So their average RAS under Tom Telesco was 7.52. So far under Joe Hortiz, that was 8.41. And honestly, if Junior Colson had actually tested, this might have gone up. If he actually went out and tested, it might have gone up. But either way, that's a full point, a full 10th percentile higher than the Chargers under Tom Telesco.
Well, I think this in particular was one of the reasons why I was so interested in like Ed Dodds as a GM candidate, because that was like his direct influence in Indianapolis. And not to say that like more athletic equals better football team, but like there was always such a clear lack of explosiveness on the Chargers under Tom Telesco, especially at the skill positions. And, you look at Kamani Vidal, the one running back who they took with an 8.88, RAS. And if he were an inch taller, that number probably goes up, Cornelius Johnson is another good example here of the wide receiver on day 3 that has a super high RAS. Let's just take a chance. We'll see what happens versus a KJ Hill type whose RAS was very, very low versus, some of these other selections. So day 3, it's still a great way for you to find some athletic upside. And that was a huge difference for me in this draft versus what the Chargers previously did under Telesco.
Yeah, I think, and I specifically do have Kamani Vidal on here because, Alex,
the running back is a huge part of that. Yes,
yes, definitely. Now, Justin Jackson, very athletic. Guess what? He actually was pretty good when they gave him the football. Like, he was actually pretty good. Imagine that. So, will Vidal be a great running back? I don't know. I hope he is, but at least you have something here that suggests the floor is much higher.
Yeah, and that athletic profile certainly pans out to potentially having a higher ceiling.
Yes, definitely.
All right. That was a great look at the comparisons here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that one. It's just like it's still a few days later, man. I'm still just like, man, like it felt so nice on draft weekend to just be like, hey, like let's just go grab good football players. It was truly refreshing experience for us. And part of that was also because we graded a lot of the players and we liked a lot of players that they took. But even if they had taken other players at positions that I, was not expecting, man, like it's a different level of trust, I think is the best way for me to say that.
Yes. And that's how I felt going into the draft, but you never know. How does this guy operate? And how does Jim Harbaugh operate, having not been in the NFL? How does Joe Hortiz operate, not under the tutelage of Newsom or DaCosta and et cetera? How does this guy look? Turns out pretty good. So I truly do mean the title, that I truly believe Joe Hortiz, at least so far in 1 year, did school his predecessor. They talked about the Chargers wanted to reimagine the GM position, what it meant to be a general manager. I don't know that anything has been reimagined so far, but it's advanced. Like, it's very much so advanced from where they were previously. So it's another step forward, finding wins in different areas. Yes, like you and I watched a lot of prospects, so it was nice to see that we knew these prospects, but it was nice to see that we knew these prospects because that meant they were probably good players. Like, they were probably in the top 200, 250 on the consensus board, which again is just a media thing. That's not an NFL draft board. It's a media thing. but it was nice to know that they were just selecting from the best talent available, which came down to both film and the relative athletic score, etc. It's been a relief for sure to have this draft class in front of me and just know, like, okay, after round one, fans weren't so sure. By the end of day two, people were like, yeah, okay, we're feeling pretty good. And with Cam Hart and all, like, you just know that you're in good hands. And then now you have the coaching staff you feel pretty good about too.
Yeah, I think that's the other way to describe it, is that it felt like there was a very clear like plan of attack. And I'm sure Tom Telesco always had a plan of attack as well, but there was never really, it was always hard for me to find like, okay, what's the theme here? Like, what's the through line of all these picks? Like, how is everything kind of tied together? Whereas with this pick, it was very obvious that they wanted to get younger, faster, more physical. They needed premium positions. They needed a true signal caller in the middle. They needed some beef in the middle. So it just felt like everything kind of tied together, and I never really felt like that was the case under Tom Telesco. It felt like, let's get our two starters and then let's just kind of like throw some darts at the board. And I hate to bury the guy, but like that's really how I felt for 11 years watching him draft. So Joe Hortiz and company, you can see right away the value is so different for what this approach is going to be. And again, like there was one pretty big reach, but for the most part, all of these players it makes sense the way that they fit in specific roles. There's no real projecty type here, maybe outside of Still, but like you're not relying on somebody to make some miracle jump to become a consistent contributor. So it's really refreshing, and I'm sure everybody in the chat here felt that as well. And we'll revisit Joe Ortiz's standards next year and see how he does next year. But I just have a lot of confidence that the draft is going to actually be like a strength of this team 1 through 7, not just 1 and 2, not just a couple star players here and there, because Telesco, he does know how to find some star players, but 1 through 7, it just feels like they're in such good hands going forward.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's been nice, and I expect it to continue because the Ravens have been so consistent. I would imagine, and with Harbaugh, with Hortiz, like we're very consistent winners in the draft, whereas before we weren't so sure. And I love that, kudos to us, I guess, but we talked about Harbaugh guys and guys that fit. So we always would draft guys that fit the Chargers. So like the mock draft we did before day 3, like we took Cam Hart, we took Justin Aboigbe, because we're like, okay, these guys fit the Chargers and how they play, their style. You had Cam Hart as my guy and a later guy and a Harbaugh guy. We talked about Junior Colson, which I guess is like duh, but that did fit them all together. And it was nice to just go, yeah, like great. All these selections totally make sense. They all fit their identity. They fit their defense. They fit their offense. They fit their play style. They fit the character. They're glass eaters. They love football. Even Still, who is our least rated, not our favorite pick of the draft so far. We have a more difficult time with that one. I still get it. Like they needed a slot corner. He can play press. He tackles. Like he plays a certain way that I think fits them. So it's a bit more projection. We're trying to get there, but even then, like I get it. It's even you got to see, like you got to see plus from both of us. I think because while the film maybe wasn't our favorite, we get where they were going with the selection. Whereas before, it's like, I don't really understand where you're doing with that one.
Yeah, that's totally fair, and I think that's pretty well said for Tarheeb Still as well. All right. I said the show is going to be shorter. Do you have any final thoughts here, Tyler? We maybe get into some of these, a couple of the super chats there, but any final thoughts on the Joe Ortiz versus Tom Telesco comparison?
I'm just excited to see how this class pans out because, bold statements for us to say this is the best draft class in 10 years.
Yeah.
Let's go see it. How is it going to pan out? I think it'll be just fine with this coaching staff. And I'm excited to revisit this. Next year we'll see, but even like give it like 3 years of drafting. Let's see how different the Chargers really are in a few years. Hopefully it makes them contenders.
Yeah, 100%. And at this point, it is on the coaching staff to go and turn this best draft class into the best draft class. So Joe Ortiz's job is to choose the players, coaching staff's job to actually develop those players. And I'm very anxious to see how that pans out. All right, couple super chats here. Brian says he was here for the shit on Tom Telesco session. It was fun, and I don't think it was too roasty. And hopefully you guys enjoyed
it was objective.
Yeah. Burley, who's the odd man out in the wide receiver room? I guess right now is Simi Fehoko. Can't keep all 7 guys.
Yeah, so we're assuming we keep 6 here. So obviously the main 3 are safe. So Palmer, Johnston, McConkey are safe. I think Davis would be safe too, especially with them retaining Ryan Fickens. I think those 4 are safe. Then it comes down to the next couple of guys. I actually think Cornelius Johnson, while taken later, would be safer than Brendan Rice because of the special teams value. Not that Brendan Rice can't do that, but I know Cornelius Johnson can. And his RAS is definitely like kind of fits that. Like he's faster. He's going to be able to cover more, work on special teams. Joe Hortiz said he was arguably the best blocker in the class too. So they want someone who can block on kick returns, punt returns. He'll be out there too. I think that he's going to be safer to make the roster than Brendan Rice. So I think it comes down to Semi Fehoko versus Brendan Rice. Ultimately, this team is very much so far like old regime gone. I think Semi Fehoko might be the odd man out here.
Yeah, I don't expect Semi Fehoko to make the roster. I think he's a training camp body, and we'll kind of see how that goes. But I lean towards them keeping the 6 now. We'll see how that changes. Zay Jones was cut today. There's still Marquez Valdes-Scantling out there. Maybe they do feel like there is a veteran wide receiver that they have to go get. But I think, the 3 that were on the roster from last year, plus Ladd, those guys are obviously all safe. And then we'll kind of see what happens there. And I'm rooting for Brendan Rice and Cornelius Johnson to make the roster. But 7th round picks get cut all the time around the league, and unfortunately, it's just a part of the business. I think the Chargers roster is in the shape where they could and should lean towards keeping those players, but I don't think anybody should pencil them as complete locks to make the roster because it's just the nature of the beast. Sometimes, maybe they just feel like they need to keep 6 defensive tackles. Maybe they need the 6 linebackers again, because that's where they want to have their special teams value. So, anything is on the table. I hope both guys make it. I hope both guys carry roles and can continue to develop into quality football players. And I think they can. So, you just never know. Like this regime might want 5 tight ends. I don't know. Like some of those things kind of carry some weight, and you have a fullback now that will make the roster theoretically. So we'll just see how it goes.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. If you look at the Ravens, end of draft history the last couple of years, their 2 picks last year to close out the 6th and 7th round picks. They didn't play any games. They have not played any games. Their last pick in 2022 has played 1 game. Their last 2 picks in 2021, they've each played 1 game. So yeah, like even the Ravens who draft phenomenally, these guys on late day 3, they don't always. Now those guys probably still are on the roster, but they're not going to play a ton either. So. I think Cornelius Johnson is the safest, though.
That's fair.
The 3 at the end.
Last one in here from NSN, at least for now. Very interested to see predictions on the depth chart. Yeah, we'll do a full post draft depth chart. Maybe they kind of sign somebody else down the road, but we did go over the depth chart a little bit. But it's tough to really build a full depth chart until does Hakeem Dent just like really hit the ground running as a safety? And is he kind of your 4th safety or 3rd safety kind of stuff? So what's Donald Parham's role going to be? Right now, he's the tight end 3, but maybe this Georgia Tech tight end just hits the ground running. So a lot of that is TBD. I think you can comfortably make a 2 deep depth chart right now, but then that's only the 26 players, so there's still obviously a lot more than that on the 53-man roster. So it's I think the team overall is in a much better spot after the draft. I mean, it was hard to be in a worse spot because the roster was tough, but anxious to see how these roles get sorted out.
Yeah, the tight end room was the one that interested me the most because there's this overhaul. I don't think Stone Smart quite fits. They've clearly shown who they would prefer out there.
Yeah.
Disley's obviously making it. Parham, they owe money to, and I don't see why you would cut him because I think he does pretty good work. And I forget who it was. Maybe it was Andy Bischoff talked about, hey, this dude's a weapon. And we feel like he has not quite been able to get out there and do all the things that he really could, mostly because of injuries. But we'll see. I think Zach Hines and Luke Benson, both the undrafted free agent tight ends, one of them more so like a fullback type. I think they have a shot to make it. I really think both those guys bring something different. And by the way, just like in general, sorting through these undrafted free agents, I actually feel like 7 of them are really good and like genuinely could make the roster based on what I've seen from some of these defensive players. Haven't really gotten to their wide receivers yet, and they have the toughest time to make it. But like the tight ends, the defensive linemen, some of these linebackers, they got a shot. And I think that's better than most classes and hauls I've seen before.
Yeah, I've only watched Akeem Dent, Thomas Harper, and the linebacker. I'm totally forgetting, but
Jean Baptiste or the other
yeah,
one? Okay.
Jean Baptiste. Yeah,
Mhm.
I like Akeem Dent a lot. I think Akeem Dent can definitely make this roster. I think he didn't get a ton of chances to really blossom at Florida State, but I think the athletic skills, the ability as a tackler, like I could definitely see him fitting in as a safety 4 type. We don't know how this regime feels about JT Woods, so maybe it's a safety 3 type. And Thomas Harper as a potential slot, I'm intrigued by him. I think he has some fun coverage stuff to his game. He went toe to toe with Emeka Ibuka, who's a future first round pick who could have been a first round pick this year. And Harper went toe to toe with him the entire game against Ohio State. Had some good games against USC and those guys as well. So those 2 players, I think, each have a chance to make the roster right now. But maybe they feel like they need to go get a veteran safety, veteran corner, whatever the case may be. But those 2, I think, are early leads for me.
Yeah, Harper was a ton of fun. I watched him, and I'm not going to give him like a draft grade, but I remember watching him going, I would probably give him a draftable grade. Like, I don't think this person should have been an undrafted free agent.
Yeah.
I liked him quite a bit. Can see why he was not like a round, day 2 player by any means, but I get the selection if they had taken him. So the fact that they got him as an undrafted free agent at a position they're going to need help in, it's pretty good.
Yeah. All right. Appreciate you guys for tuning in today. Hopefully you enjoyed the Joe Hortiz versus Tom Telesco comparisons. On Thursday's show, we're going to have some draft superlatives. And then, like I mentioned yesterday, hopefully some fun guests on the show next week. So we're excited to get to that point. That's going to do it for us today. Make sure like, review, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff does help continue to grow the show. Tell a friend. All of that is sincerely appreciated. So that's going to do it for us today. This has been another episode of the Guilty as Charged podcast. We'll see you next time. As always, bolt up.